Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in, because today we are taking a highly structured visual journey through the foundational historical texts of the Old Testament. We're going to look at exactly how a nation was born, how it was organized, and ultimately how it fractured. Understanding this epic narrative gives us incredible insight into the timeless cycles of human civilization, leadership, and society. So let's get started. Here is our roadmap for today. We're moving chronologically through 5 phases. Beginnings and deliverance, the wilderness journey and laws, Canaan and the judges, the turning point into the era of kings, and finally, the kingdom divides. That's 11 books detailing the dramatic rise, peak, and sudden fracture of a nation. Kicking things off with Phase 1, Beginnings and Deliverance. This covers the very origins of the world and the Israelites' eventual escape from captivity in Egypt. To really grasp this, we have to start with Genesis. And wow, this first book is incredibly dense. It covers a staggering span of 2,000 years, starting right from Adam. I mean, think about how much history happens in just a single century. This book covers 20 of them. To actually make sense of that massive timeline, we can break the first part of Genesis down into 4 distinct historical eras: creation, the fall, the flood, and the division of nations. These 4 major events essentially set the grand stage for literally everything that follows in the biblical narrative. But then, interestingly enough, the narrative abruptly shifts gears. After covering all those massive global events, Genesis narrows its focus entirely onto the lives of just 4 foundational figures: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The whole book then wraps up with the death of this final figure, Joseph. That brings us right to the book of Exodus. Now, during Joseph's time, the people had relocated to Egypt. But over time, that situation turned into full-blown captivity. Here, God uses Moses to rescue these people, leading them out of Egypt and beginning their grand journey into the wilderness. Now, along this journey, they aren't just aimlessly wandering around. God actively gives them laws and some highly specific instructions on how to build the tabernacle, which was a central place of worship. And they actually successfully construct it. Moving on to Phase 2, the wilderness journey and laws. This is the crucial era where the Israelites receive their core civic and spiritual organization. With the tabernacle built, the book of Leviticus acts as a direct instructional follow-up. It really has 2 main focuses. It details the daily duties of the Levite tribe within that newly built tabernacle, and it establishes the strict protocols required for their sacrificial system. Once those laws are firmly established, the narrative shifts into the book of Numbers. This book tracks their actual, on-the-ground wandering through the wilderness. And trust me, it wasn't a quick trip. This difficult journey turned into the ultimate unintended camping trip, spanning roughly 38 years of historical events. Deuteronomy elegantly rounds out this whole wilderness era. Think of this book as Moses delivering his complete, final message and sermon to the Israelites. At the very end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies, and he officially passes the mantle of leadership over to his successor, Joshua. And that brings us to an incredibly chaotic new chapter. Phase 3, Canaan and the Judges. The Israelites finally enter the Promised Land, but as we're about to see, they are going to deeply struggle to maintain their faith and their leadership structure. We immediately see this stark contrast. On one hand, under Joshua's strong leadership, they successfully captured the land of Canaan and methodically divided up among the tribes. But almost immediately after his death, total failure. The people turn away from God and, as a direct result, find themselves oppressed by surrounding Gentile nations. Because they lacked proper leaders after Joshua, a fascinating, albeit repetitive cycle begins in the book of Judges. The people would rebel, face oppression, repent, and then God would rescue them. How? Well, by raising up specific leaders called judges. In total, the text records exactly 12 of these judges who stepped up to save the repentant people. Now, hidden right within this turbulent, often violent era of the judges, we find the brief book of Ruth. Instead of focusing on massive battles or national politics, this book zooms way in. It gives us an intimate, detailed look at the events and struggles of one specific family: a husband, a wife, and their children living through those incredibly chaotic days. Next up is Phase 4, Turning Point, the Era of Kings. The political and spiritual landscape of Israel is about to change forever. So 1 Samuel represents a massive paradigm shift in biblical history. The nation officially abandons the era of judges, where they were led by local deliverers, and steps directly into a centralized monarchy. This fundamentally changes how they are governed. But why did this shift happen in the first place? Well, the text tells us that the sons of the current leaders, Eli and Samuel, were corrupt. They just weren't fit to rule. Because of this, the Israelite people demanded a king so they could be just like the surrounding Gentile nations. This introduces 4 key figures to our narrative: Eli, Samuel, Saul, who becomes the very first king, and his servant David. The biblical text actually cleanly divides the reigns of these first 2 kings. 1 Samuel concludes with the dramatic death of the first king, Saul. Meanwhile, the next book, 2 Samuel, is entirely dedicated to chronicling the subsequent life and reign of King David. Which brings us to our final section, Phase 5. And without a doubt, this is the most tragic turning point in this entire historical explainer. The kingdom divides. We move into the book of 1 Kings, which traces the royal succession. David dies, and his son Solomon takes the throne as king. Solomon's reign is recorded from chapter 1 to chapter 11. But once we hit chapter 12, the historical narrative abruptly and violently fractures. The whole scene completely changes. The once united 12 tribes heavily fracture. They basically break apart into a completely separate kingdom made up of 10 tribes, leaving behind a tiny, isolated kingdom of just 2 tribes. It's a massive split. This division in 1 Kings chapter 12 is a monumental turning point. Up until this exact moment, a single king had ruled over all 12 tribes and a united Israel. This split abruptly and permanently ends that era of unity. As we wrap up this explainer, looking at a nation torn completely in 2, we're left with a massive cliffhanger. We really have to ask ourselves, how will this devastating split impact the survival, the identity, and the ultimate destiny of these newly divided kingdoms? Will they survive being surrounded by hostile nations, or will this fracture be their absolute undoing? That is the burning question that drives the rest of the historical texts. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.